Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia.
Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia.
Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble of heart. Alleluia,
Alleluia, alleluia.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, the lawyers and Pharisees were watching him closely. When Jesus noticed how the guests chose their places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host, and the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place," and then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Jesus said also to the Pharisees who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or sisters or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Good morning.
Good morning.
As some of you have known, I've had the privilege of flying all over the world, just about to every country, every continent you can think of. The only one I've not been to yet is South America, and that's a yet. All through Asia, all through Europe, all through Central America, certainly all through the North American continent, Australia. At one point, I had over 5 million frequent flyer miles to my name. I was like super duper, ultra platinum, gold, diamond on several airlines. And believe me, that kind of status has its privileges. I mean, except for those airlines where they fly like puddle jumpers and there is nothing else, I haven't flown coach, and Tony will tell you, 30 years or something like that? But of all the upgraded flights I've ever had, let me tell you about Etihad Airlines. I worked for a nonprofit at the time, and I had a deal with them that I would take considerable less compensation if I was able to fly business class. And the reason for that is most of our facilities were in places like Cambodia and Laos and Kenya, which were like 30-hour flights, and Big Daddy was not going to fly in the back of the airplane, so I did this deal with them. Well, on Etihad, which is one of the only airlines that you could really use to get to these kinds of places, they had a deal where if you bid, they let you bid, if you bought a business class ticket, you could bid on first class. And the bids started like $150. Well, Tony will tell you, I've never lost one of the bids, and it cost me like another $150, $200, maybe $300, but that was about it. You have not lived till you've seen first class air travel on Etihad Airlines. So let me kind of give you a little rundown what it's like. First of all, the limo comes and picks you up at your house and takes you to Dulles Airport, where you go into the special first class lounge, where the food is the quality of a 5-star restaurant, I kid you not. You can rent a room if you'd like to have a little shut-eye before you get on the plane. You can have a massage, all kinds of little pampering and things like that in the first class lounge. When it was time for your flight, you went through a separate gangway to the front of the plane. Not with all the other people who were like pushing and shoving to get into the back of the plane. You went to the front of the plane. Where at the end of the gangway, the maitre d' would greet you and say, "Oh, Mr. Ristoffer, welcome to Etihad Airlines flight," well, whatever it was. "Steward, please show Mr. Ristoffer to his apartment." Not seat, apartment. And it was an apartment. So you go up there, and there's a door. They open the door up for you. You walk in. There's a big leather chair like the one John's sitting on right now. That's your chair. There's a widescreen TV in it like this one. And there's a table that has flowers, and it's got your name tag and your cocktails already ready for you with, of course, like nuts and little crudités and things like that. And while you're kind of getting settled, they hang your stuff up in the closet. Your personal chef shows up. Yvonne was the one I had like 3 times, his name. And he tells you what's on the menu for that flight. The entrees they had, there's a rack of lamb, there's a veal chop, there's a halibut, there's a this, and the sauces and all that kind of stuff. What are the soups? I mean soups, plural, that you could have. The appetizers and all that. And like a cruise, if you wanted to, you could have 3 appetizers, you could have 2 entrees. And the other big thing is you ate when you wanted to eat. Not like when the cart comes along on the back, you know. You could say, well, I'll have my dinner at 9 o'clock, Washington time, you know, and they'd say, well, it'll be right there. And sure enough, they'd come in, they'd set your table up. You had real china, real crystal, you had real silverware, and they'd serve your meal like you're in, like I said, a Washington, D.C. restaurant. They also gave you pajamas. When it was ready, you went to this bathroom, which was all marble and had gold fixtures and things like that, and you put on your pajamas and your cushy bedroom slippers and went back to your cabin, and by that time they would have made up your bed. So that big seat had actually become a full bed where you could tell them how many pillows you wanted, how many blankets you wanted, do you want a comforter. The only rule was you had to loosely keep the seatbelt attached around you so that they could see it if there was any turbulence. And then when you woke up, you told them when you wanted to wake up, breakfast would start, and the same thing would start all over again. You had all this choice of all these different things. And of course, when you arrived there, you went through a special expedited customs process, and then you had a limo take you back to your hotel. I can tell you that kind of an experience totally ruins your expectations about air travel forever. Nothing looks the same after that. That kind of pampering really messes with your brain. And even first class and other airlines, which we've flown from time to time, seems like it's well, compared to this stuff. I mean, where's my pajamas? You know, and whatever. Status and privilege are like that. They're highly attractive and highly seductive. Status and privilege are not necessarily bad in and for themselves, but they're not necessarily good either. And it's funny how we often gripe about privilege when others have it and we don't. But when we have it and others don't, we don't seem to mind. In fact, it feels pretty good. I can tell you, sitting there in my pajamas, in my full bed, it felt really good. And I didn't even realize it was the back of the plane. I mean, I was just in the moment right there. I mean, and let's be honest, we all, to some degree, have some sort of privilege relative to others. Something in our lives. We're all either smarter or better looking or healthier or stronger or wealthier than somebody else. Perhaps we have better access to influence or better position power or maybe even better expertise. We all have something, perhaps many things, by which we have an opportunity, perhaps even the temptation, to lord it over others. Status and privilege are seriously alluring. And being unaware of their power, their seductive power, can lead one into a self-sense of one's worth. Ultimately, can lead to arrogance, can lead to selfishness and pride, the roots of all sin. Status and privilege can lead us to think more of ourselves than we are. They can, but they don't have to. And the question is, how do we act when we have status, when we have privilege? How do we respond to others? How do we treat others who have less status and less privilege than we do? I mean, in our scriptures today, God's revelation is about the plan he has on how we should act. The book of Sirach that you heard this morning, which is also called Ecclesiasticus, was written about 190 BC. Many of the proverbs in that book were used to train the sons of the wealthy, the princes, in how proper court conduct should be done, what proper behavior was like. Most of the intended audience of that book had wealth, had status, had privilege, and yet Sirach says, "My child, conduct your affairs with humility, and you will be loved more than the giver of gifts." It's an interesting idea. As I said, the audience of that book, in fact, had power and privilege. And the advice is not to give it up. In fact, it probably wasn't possible. But rather to use it humbly. I mean, one of the dictionary definitions of humility is that it's a recognition of our place in relationship to God and a subsequent submission to God. That in turn leads one to see status and privilege as undeserved by one's own position, and rather as a freely given gift from God. In other words, humility helps you go to generosity, helps you see your privilege as a way to serve others. And Jesus is in kind of the same mindset. He's aware, if you heard that story, listen to it carefully, he's very aware that status and privilege exist. And he doesn't call for the ending of it. He doesn't even challenge it. He assumes that there's going to be people who are in places of honor and those who are not. He doesn't condemn his ranking system. Instead, he takes the opportunity as he watches how people are jockeying for positions of power and honor at this banquet to teach. You know, in the scriptures, the banquet, an idea of a banquet, is a common metaphor for the reign of God. In fact, in the Bible, the words for banquet are used 72 times. Luke loves putting Jesus at a banquet. I said a little story this morning about the wedding feast of Cana. That was a banquet. Jesus is always getting put into a banquet. That's probably because meals, banquets, big festivities like that, were, first of all, commonly understood as a social convention by everybody, just as they are today. And they're there for an ideal setting to teach lessons. So in today's case, it's a chance to teach how privilege works in society, how to understand it, and most importantly, how to deal with it if you're going to be a follower of Christ. Because at God's banquet, all are nourished sumptuously. Everyone has a place. Nobody has to pick up the bill. The bill's paid for by God. At God's banquet, wealth, status, gender, nationality, culture have nothing to do with distinguishing rank or importance. Instead, differences are celebrated. They contrast with one another like a mosaic, creating this incredibly beautiful, complex design of God. So, In this morning's reading from St. Luke, Jesus is less interested in the meal itself and more interested in how seats are assigned and how they're taken and who's invited. His intent is not to teach social etiquette, but to draw lessons about the kingdom of God. He teaches us a lesson on humility, as God understands it, which is one of the faces of love. That's what humility is. Where greatness is measured by concern for others and a modest estimation of self, and where it is dishonorable to presume that one's position, social or otherwise, will automatically win favor with God. You know, in an honor and shame culture, as most Western societies have been since those days, avoiding shame is of utmost importance. And seeking honor is wonderful if you can get it. Shame is not bad simply because it's an embarrassment, but it might in fact have tangible implications for the shame's family, the shame's village, whatever. There could be drastic implications for one's social interactions, relationships, earning ability, life prospects. On the opposite end, public honor can have very positive effects on all these same things. So there's a built-in incentive in life to grab for those places of honor and all the privileges they provide. But Jesus' parable to his fellow diners, and through them to us, is that they should not fall for this game. This is the same prophet, after all, who said we should be wise like serpents. Well, here he is saying, really be smart about this. This lure to be first, to be the one on top, as I said, is very seductive, but it's also risky, and it may even be foolish. Once you're on top, it's precarious, and you could fall down, or perhaps even be kicked down, and that walk of shame to the bottom is humiliating. Jesus instead says, always start at the low end of the pecking order. Why? Because from there's only one place to go, and that's up. At the bottom, you can't be shamed or embarrassed because you're not overstating your stature. According to Jesus, therefore, there's significance in everything we do, even how we position ourselves in our lives, in our families, in our neighborhoods, with friends, at work, at church. Wherever we are, he insists, do not recline at table in the place of honor. Instead, be so honest as to appreciate not only your own real importance, but the importance of others. That's true humility. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Sirach puts it this way: humble yourself the more, the greater you are, and you will find favor with God. And when it's your turn to host, do not invite your friends, your brothers, your relatives, your rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you be repaid, but instead, give a banquet, invite the poor, the lame, the crippled, the blind, and you'll be blessed because they cannot repay you. You will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. In other words, avoid the grandstanders and instead invite those who simply want to be there to enjoy you and the event rather than the seen and be seen charade. That's how the banquet of God unfolds. There's no such thing as rank among the participants because their attendance is attributed to nothing except the fact that they are loved completely for who they are. That equalizes everybody, even as it preserves the uniqueness and diversity that make them a reflection of God's incredible creativity. Jesus tells his well-to-do host that he'd have a really better party if he invited folks with whom he'd never associated. He'd be enriched by his fellow humans who were from the other side of the tracks. Now remember, as his listeners are hearing this, the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, the diseased, in the world in which Jesus lived, in which Luke lived, were outcasts. They were despised and condemned. And in Israel particularly, they were seen as having committed some great sin, or their parents did. And because of that sin, God made them the way they are, the outcasts, with their infirmities. They were to blame for their situation. They brought this on themselves. We say that about people in our society today. Why would you want to help such people, let alone invite them into your home? We make those distinctions today. We stick with our own kind and reinforce our own ways of thinking and our ways of doing stuff. Such gatherings help us feel comfortable and satisfied. It's natural, but it's also an inherent weakness. It has this weakness of limiting our vision and supporting us in building up our own kingdom of earth, on earth, not God's. The guest list that Jesus proposes rips down these walls of security and safety by only dining with one's kind. But the kind of guest that Jesus suggests, we just may be seeing things from other points of view that we don't know about. We may even abandon our look at me behavior and discover the delights in differences. Perhaps humility will then become a natural attitude, and we'll find ourselves not only comfortable with diversity, but also delighting in it. That need to say, look at me, will decrease because everyone will be watching one another with admiration and wonder. That's true humility. And that's much better preparation for joining at God's eternal banquet. So as we prepare to celebrate this banquet, the banquet of the Lord's Supper, today's Mass, let us pray for humility and for hospitality and for generosity, all to thrive in our hearts. May God bless you all.